Hello, welcome to the Macquarie University Liberal Club Sunday Sessions podcast, live from the Facebook main page. My name is Andrew Cremon, and I'm joined, as always, by Rory O'Connor.
Hey, how's it going, legend?
It's good to see you. I'm good, Rory. After recent talks, a joint statement by Russia and China states that the friendship between the two countries has no limits. Both of them seem to have their sights on Taiwan and Ukraine, though there seems to be some disagreement from those countries about them. NATO, AUKUS, and other Western allies are trying to deter any possible invasion. Today, we will be speaking with Malcolm Davis, Senior Analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Malcolm, welcome.
Oh, good to be with you guys.
A quick disclaimer that ASPI is an independent, non-partisan think tank, and this interview should not be interpreted as support for the Liberal Party. As always, you guys can post your questions in the comments section, and we'll try and get to as many of them as we can. We'll start firstly with China and Taiwan. What is the main conflict between the two of them, and why is it so important for China to take the island nation?
Well, look, I think that Taiwan is seen by the People's Republic of China as part of Chinese territory. Now, historically, the People's Republic of China has never controlled Taiwan. If you obviously think about historical background, Taiwan was essentially handed to Japan late in the period of pre-revolutionary China, and after the end of the Second World War was handed back to Chinese nationalist forces. There was a civil war between the Chinese nationalist forces and the Chinese communist forces. The Chinese nationalists lost, evacuated to the island of Formosa, which is Taiwan, and so the nationalist forces controlled essentially Taiwan. But China has always sought to take back Taiwan from their perspective. From the perspective of the Taiwanese people, they see themselves not as part of China. They see themselves as essentially Taiwanese. They want to maintain the status quo, which is essentially Taiwan is not independent per se, but it does exist essentially apart from China, separated by the Taiwan Straits. For the Chinese, this is unacceptable. They have promoted this concept called the 1992 consensus, which basically would undertake discussions about unification on China's terms. Taiwanese refused to accept that 1992 consensus. So the risk is now that the Chinese will essentially move from diplomacy to try and get Taiwan back to the use of force in various different ways. And there's a number of ways that they're likely to do that. I think that firstly, you will see what's known as a grey zone campaign, whereby they use coercive measures short of war to try and convince the Taiwanese to accept unification on Beijing's terms. So that grey zone campaign could involve, for example, cyber attacks. It could involve trying to increase economic and diplomatic isolation. It could involve even seizing offshore territories such as Pratas Island or Kinmen or Kamoyan Matsu. But the objective would be to increase the pressure on the government in Taipei, so in the end they buckle and they accept China's terms for unification. I think that the risk of that grey zone campaign happening in the next few years is very high. And you can argue that China's flights of fighter aircraft through Taiwan's air defense identification zone is ADIZ, is the first step in that process. If that coercive campaign fails, then we are talking probably a war across the Taiwan Straits where China uses brute force to try and invade and occupy China uses military force to invade and occupy Taiwan. And then the big question is, of course, how does the US and its allies, including Australia, respond to that scenario? So that's where I see China, Taiwan heading at this point in time.
They can also take some of the surrounding islands, though, can't they?
Yes, I mean, there's a series of offshore islands, as I talked about, Pratas Island, which is in the South China Sea. Itu Arbor is another one. Kinmen, just literally across the waters from China. I visited Kinmen, and you can stand out and you can actually see China just on the horizon. Quemoy and Matsu are two historical islands where the Chinese tried to take that. So there is a series of offshore territories which the Chinese could try and seize as part of any coercion grey zone campaign. The Taiwanese would obviously try to defend those islands, but it may be difficult for them to defend all of them. But really, seizing offshore territories doesn't actually get China the main prize, which is Taiwan itself. And so it could be that they seize these offshore territories and the Taiwanese government says, we are still not going to accept your terms for unification because we seek the status quo. We do not seek to become part of China. And I think that determination on the part of the Taiwanese people and the Taiwanese government to remain essentially where they are now in terms of in maintaining a stable and secure cross-straits relationship with China has been reinforced by what they've seen happen in Hong Kong, where the Chinese government have brutally suppressed the freedoms of free speech and a free media and democracy. Obviously, Xinjiang is another area where the Taiwanese are watching with concern as large numbers of Uyghurs are put in re-education camps, and they don't want that future for themselves. So, it is quite understandable that I think the Taiwanese are saying no to China. The long-term effect of that, of course, is it makes war more likely in the future.
And this behavior from China, has this been continuous since the Communist Party took over, or has it ramped up more recently? And if so, is there a particular reason why China would be pushing more for it right now?
Look, obviously we had a series of crises between China and Taiwan in the 50s during Eisenhower's administration, where there was the possibility of war. Things went largely quiet from then on through to really the emergence of Xi Jinping as the new leader of China. And I think Xi has really made it a strong commitment on his part to his credibility as essentially the president for life in China to ensure that Taiwan is retaken by China. And I think that's why we're seeing an increase in tension between China and Taiwan really since 2012 onwards, when Xi became president. And I think that at this point in time, when you look at Xi's speeches, the preparation for of the PLA for operations and everything, it becomes very difficult for Xi to back away from that determination to take Taiwan against the will of the Taiwanese people. So, in the same way, for example, you're seeing with Russia and Ukraine at the moment, with Putin essentially backing himself into the corner of having to go to war with Ukraine, I think Xi is doing the same thing with Taiwan. I think Xi is determined to take Taiwan. He can't back away from that, because if he backs away from taking Taiwan, he loses all credibility, he loses his grip on power, and he's finished. He would be removed. So from his perspective, taking Taiwan is essential, and they can't wait until 2049 to do it. He wants it done on his watch. And I think the concern is that the Chinese will make a move, probably a cross-straits invasion sometime this decade, probably from about 2025, 2026 onwards, to completely retake Taiwan. And that's where the danger point is from Western states, from the US perspective, from Australia, from Tokyo. Watching this progression towards that war, I think, is where we're at now, and preparing for that conflict. And that's why you've had an update to Australia's defence policy in 2020, and then, of course, AUKUS in 2021.
So for China, then, would you say that taking Taiwan is more to do with reputation as opposed to actually any sort of strategic purpose of gaining Taiwan?
Oh, look, it's both. I think if you look at the geostrategy of the Indo-Pacific region, if China controls Taiwan, then it's much easier for the PLA to project power decisively out to what's known as the second island chain, including Guam, and to dominate that region between the first island chain and the second island chain. So that allows them to extend their counter-intervention capabilities much more dramatically than what will be the case if they can only project power out to the first island chain. So that's point one. Point two, I think, is from Taiwan, they could easily then project military power and presence north to isolate Japan if they wanted to pressure Japan, or they could pivot south and increase their control over the South China Sea to pressure states such as the Philippines and other ASEAN states. So Taiwan is that proverbial unsinkable aircraft carrier from which Chinese military power can be more easily projected across the Indo-Pacific. But it also is about reputation, particularly reputation of Xi Jinping. If they don't take Taiwan, then Xi's credibility is torn to shreds and he's finished as president. He will not accept that because he's determined to essentially create what's becoming a cult of personality. He wants to be more important in history than Mao Zedong. So, ultimately, that objective for him personally and for the credibility of the Chinese Communist Party in general, I think is on the line if they don't take Taiwan.
If I could shift gears now to Russia and the Ukraine. So talk to us about the main conflict that's going on up there. There are different news sources that I've watched that give explanations ranging from NATO expansion into Eastern Europe to the Donbass region to restore and to Russia trying to restore the former Soviet Union. What do you think?
Well, firstly, let's talk about the NATO expansion argument. To put it bluntly, this is nonsense. NATO made it very clear to the Russians that there was no written agreement, no verbal agreement that NATO would not expand. There was a verbal agreement between NATO and the Soviet Union, or post-Soviet Russia, I should say, that they would not expand into Eastern Germany until German reunification had been completed. And people, often mention, not 1 inch of NATO expansion. They take that as to mean, NATO expansion in general. No, that actually refers to NATO expansion into Eastern Germany whilst reunification was in the process of being negotiated. But there was never any verbal or written agreement by NATO to Moscow that NATO would never expand. Second point about this is that states in Central Europe like Poland and Hungary and the Czech Republic and indeed later on the Baltic states and Romania and so forth joined NATO of their own free will for protection from Russia. There was no coercion of these states to join NATO, which I think you can contrast, for example, between that process and the process by which the Warsaw Pact during the Cold War forcibly was imposed upon these Central European states. So the Central European states sought alignment with the West. They sought a free market economy. They sought democracy, and they sought membership of NATO and the EU for their own interests and for protection against Russia, which they feared would return as a threat, and how correct they were. So I do not buy into the NATO expansion argument at all. Period. Full stop. It's nonsense. Okay. So what is causing this crisis now? I do think that what you are seeing is that Putin in Moscow sees the end of the Cold War as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. He's determined to overturn the outcome of the Cold War. He's determined to impose a sphere of influence on Central Europe. And that's one of the reasons why one of his two key demands to NATO in this current crisis is that NATO withdraw to 1997 boundaries, because what he wants is to expand his sphere of influence into places such as the Baltic states, Romania, Hungary, Poland, and so forth. So you've got Putin, who is a revanchist. He's determined to restore Russian influence and power, not the Soviet Union per se, but Russia. He wants a greater Russia that essentially would incorporate not only Ukraine but Belarus and ultimately, potentially other states in Central Asia. But it's really Ukraine and Belarus that are critical interest to him. And so I think what you're seeing is that he's seeing Western leadership as weak at the moment. He looked at what happened in Afghanistan with the chaotic withdrawal by the Americans from Afghanistan. He's looking at disunity and division within Europe, and he's seeing now's his opportunity to achieve that goal of essentially reversing the outcome of the Cold War and asserting Russian power not only across Ukraine and Belarus, but also beyond into the Central European region. And people ask, well, why are the Americans and other NATO states reinforcing NATO's eastern frontier? They're doing it to deter Putin from taking the next step beyond Ukraine, which is to threaten a NATO state, and probably the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. And I think that's key. It's that concern that we are once again facing the prospect of major power conflict in Europe that we all assumed, at the end of history, it was never going to happen. Well, we were wrong, and we are now facing that prospect.
So one of the follow-up questions I had on that was, where do countries such as Syria or Kazakhstan come into Russia's kind of plan that you mentioned there?
Syria has been a great military training ground for Russia. It's amazing the amount of Russian military personnel, officers, high-level officers, as well as military hardware that has gone through Syria in rapid succession to gain new skills, to try out new capabilities, to work out how to employ new types of military technology effectively. The Russian military has used Syria as a lab to try out and experiment with modernization. And it's interesting, if you look at the difference between the Russian military in the 1994 invasion of Chechnya versus where they are now in 2022, not only have they rapidly modernized most of their equipment so that it's first rate now, but they've also got so much experience in Syria that they are highly professional and highly skilled. So it's almost a completely different military as a result of that experience gained in Syria. I think Kazakhstan is a different situation. Kazakhstan, is obviously energy rich, but the Russians are treading delicately there because China has interest in Kazakhstan as well. So what the Russians want is to have an assured influence there through essentially putting in a puppet regime and maintaining stability and security. They certainly don't want to get dragged into any prolonged conflict, which is why when you saw that military intervention into Kazakhstan a few weeks back, it was so sharp and quick. And once again, that's good training for the Russian military. And I do think that the Russians, are probably looking on at Central Asia and thinking, well, this is important, but we have to be wary of China's interests here as well. And our immediate priority is Ukraine and Belarus, not Central Asia.
Joe Biden has threatened economic sanctions on Russia if it makes any attempts into Ukraine. I believe these sanctions would not be insignificant. Could you tell us what they might look like?
Essentially, my understanding is that the sanctions will be more targeted against Putin himself and the people around Putin, the Siloviki as they're called, designed to cause as much pain on that group of business and military and political elite that Putin relies on to stay in power. So I think what Biden is talking about is pressuring Russia economically at the apex rather than at the nadir. In other words, rather than trying to impose sanctions along the breadth of Russian society and Russian economy, which probably would fail. What he's proposing is to pressure the very leadership in the top so that maybe that is a deterrent to Putin, because the Siloviki, the people around him, will say, look, we're going to lose personally. There's already been talk of seizing Russian properties in London and so forth. So we're going to lose personally from your invasion of Ukraine, so don't do it. That's one objective, I think. in terms of the broader aspect of those sanctions approaches, I'm not certain it's going to be that effective, because the Russians have firstly built up their financial reserves considerably over the last few years. So they've got a lot of reserve. They've got a big safety net against sanctions that they can rely on. Secondly, as soon as the Russians go into Ukraine, the price of oil is going to skyrocket, and that's going to benefit the Russian economy. So whilst that sanctions approach by Biden may put some pressure on the leadership, including the undeclared leadership of the Siloviki, I'm not sure it's actually going to do the job that Biden is hoping, which is to deter Putin from not invading Ukraine. So I'm not that confident the sanctions approach will work.
So if we were to talk on the flip side now, what's the West's perspective? Why is it so important for the West to kind of protect Ukraine, protect Taiwan? I know you've touched on that, but is there a future plan for the West beyond Ukraine and Taiwan?
Well, let's start with Ukraine. I mean, I think the West recognizes that it can't afford to get sucked into an actual direct military conflict with Russia over Ukraine. Ukraine is not a NATO member yet, so therefore it's not protected under Article 5. So therefore there's no legal obligation for NATO states to protect it. Having said that, there is an ethical or moral obligation here, whereby we can't simply do nothing as the Russians essentially expand their 2014 invasion, which saw them take Crimea and annex that and instigate a proxy war in the Donbass. We can't simply do nothing as they then expand that to take Kiev, to take Odessa in the south, to take Kharkiv in the east. We can't do nothing. So we have to respond somehow. So what you're seeing is arms shipments to Ukraine, possibly intelligence sharing with the Ukrainian military, greater willingness to obviously promote or support Ukraine's interests politically. But I think the key response for the West is really preventing Putin from thinking that, oh, the West is weak and divided, I can now take the Baltic states. And that's why you've got this buildup of reinforcements on NATO's eastern frontier. They're small at the moment, but if things start going south, then I think the NATO response force would be brought in, and that's about 45,000 troops. And that would be a much more different story. But we may not have a huge amount of time to do that, because they're talking potentially about sort of February 20th to 25th when things could start to happen in Ukraine. So I do think that in the broader sense, the concern of the West is to deter a wider war that would probably be a NATO-Russia war, with all the potential implications in terms of rapid escalation to use of nuclear weapons and so on and so forth. If we switch over to the Indo-Pacific region, the concern has to be to deter, once again, China from initiating that final attack on Taiwan, and to change their decision calculus in Beijing so that they realize actually launching that cross-straits invasion is a bad move. Let's just continue with the status quo. That may not work for the reasons I've explained. Taking Taiwan is really vital to Xi Jinping and also to the Chinese Communist Party. So that second aspect of our policy beyond deterrence is, how do we respond if that does actually happen? How do we prepare for that war that could occur in the second half of this decade, and potentially be a very large, high-intensity war that could be protracted in nature rather than short and sharp.
During the annexation of Crimea, there was an extraordinary amount of military personnel who defected to Russia in that time. Do you anticipate something along those lines when it comes to Ukraine in general?
Look, that's an interesting question. I don't obviously have a good answer, because I can't get into the minds of the Ukrainian soldiers now sitting on the front line. But I think that Crimea is somewhat different from a full-on Russian invasion of Ukraine, where the objective of the Russians are to, for example, encircle Kiev and starve it into submission, to take Kharkiv, to take Mariupol and Odessa in the south, to essentially occupy and annex a huge amount of Ukraine, I would be very surprised if large numbers of Ukrainian soldiers were to throw up their rifles in surrender and go across the lines. I think this is a completely different situation.
Do you anticipate that Russia and China will split the West's priorities and move on both their targets at the same time?
Well, this is a hot topic for debate on social media. Are Moscow and Beijing coordinating? Is there a hashtag dragon pair effect in play? I think that there is coordination. I know a lot of my contemporary strategic policy thinkers would challenge that, but I think the evidence is very clear that they are coordinating. But I don't see China making a move against Taiwan at the same time as Russia goes into Ukraine, because, as I said, China's strategy is build up coercive effect through grey zone operations in coming years. And when the PLA is ready, by about the middle of this decade, if Taipei has not gone down on one knee and accepted China's terms, then you will see China move against Taiwan. But I do think that Russia is going to move soon. I don't see them backing off, because if they back off now, they've achieved absolutely nothing. They've lost credibility. They've gained nothing. And I think that would probably be the end of Putin. So, I think that Putin is committed. I think that you will see Russian military operations against Ukraine commence sometime this month.
You said that sort of 2025 onwards, you might expect a larger campaign when it comes to Taiwan. Do you really think that the Chinese would wait for a potential second term of President Trump and then make the war then?
The return of Trump is a wild card scenario. Just what he would do, knowing that it's his final term in office. We assume that he recognizes that it's his final term in office. There's no guarantees with Trump, but the potential damage he could do to the international system, to U.S. leadership and reputation, to U.S. domestic stability, is all there. And I think people would be incredibly concerned about that. And maybe the Chinese, might take the attitude, well, look, the return of Trump was going to promote so much domestic unrest and rioting and increasing splits politically within the US political system, that it actually is better for them to move when Trump is in the Oval Office than it would be for, say, some other Democrat president. I have a feeling that Biden's only going to be a one-term president. I don't think he'll be running again. I think that the Trump factor is a real wild card. We simply don't know how the Chinese would respond to a second Trump administration. That's an interesting scenario. I think that we could sort of play out and see how that could emerge.
Among the talk in regards to Donald Trump returning to the presidency is that he could potentially return at the start of next year or the end of this year, and that he be elected to Speaker of the House. Republicans in the House and Senate both, that they take both houses. They impeach Joe Biden, and with Donald Trump sort of third in line, there's a path for him directly to the presidency well before 2024. Hence why I'm wondering whether China and Russia would in fact move at the same time significantly earlier than people tend to predict.
That's an interesting scenario. I hadn't thought about Trump as Speaker, but it does make sense if the Republicans were to seize control of both the Senate and the House in the midterms. I don't know about the legal aspects of bringing someone in from outside who's not a standing politician to become Speaker. I'm not sure how that works, but if that were legally and constitutionally allowable, then that would be a very interesting way that Trump could be brought back in as Speaker. And then, as you say, they would try to impeach Biden. They might have the numbers, and then, but then if they impeach Biden, then Kamala Harris has to become president. They can't remove her as well. So I think what it would mean is that maybe Trump would be in a stronger position to then run as in 2024 for the presidency from being Speaker of the House. So, that's an interesting scenario. I'll have to think about that.
Senator Jim Mullen told us last year that Australia is better equipped militarily than it has ever been. but that we lacked a national defense strategy simply because Canberra was too busy focused on other areas. I believe that interview with us took place before the AUKUS deal. Are we getting closer to having a national defense strategy? What are your thoughts?
I think we are. I mean, I think that the 2020 Defence Strategic Update and the Force Structure Plan really did drive home that we are focusing on the Indo-Pacific region rather than getting distracted into other areas, which I think is a very good thing. And then AUKUS, of course, reinforces our role. It's not a strategic alliance, it's a technology sharing agreement. But what it does is gives us a greater ability to burden share with the US and the UK in a manner that's consistent with the defence strategy that was enunciated in the Defence Strategic Update. Add into that the Quad, which is becoming far more important. And really, I think that we are starting to see the threads come together where you could see a national defence strategy that incorporates not just the military dimension, but also the national security dimension and the foreign policy dimension. And I think that national strategy is something that the government in the next government after the May election needs to move forward with. And I think that there's certainly little daylight between the Liberal National Coalition and the top leadership of the Labor Party on defence and foreign policy affairs, such that that national strategy could certainly go forward. So that's a positive thing.
We also have an audience question that's just come in, just touching on this Quad that you mentioned there. The person has said that in the past, India was fairly kind of neutral. It wasn't necessarily aligned with the West because it had relations with Russia and exchanging military and stuff. Do you think the reason why India has become more involved with organizations like the Quad because of China?
Yes, the tensions building along the India-China border in the Himalayas have been a huge factor in changing India's calculus. They used to be very much, not willing to move too far too fast because it wasn't just the relationship with Russia, it was the relationship with China as well, which they were trying to promote. But I think they have recognized that China is a revisionist power, is seeking to create a sphere of influence that would be at the expense of their interests, particularly in disputed territories along the India-China border, as well as the growing power and capability of the PLA Navy to expand Chinese influence along the 21st century maritime Silk Road into the Indian Ocean that would see Chinese presence in the Indian Ocean. I think that India is changing its approach, and the Quad being revitalized is part of that process. Now, the Quad is not an Asian NATO. It's not a defense alliance. It's a foreign policy and national security dialogue process that looks at a range of issues, all of which have relevance to defense and strategic policy. I see the Quad ultimately evolving down those lines, whereby maybe there's future opportunities to have a tighter focus on military cooperation, but at the moment that's not its purpose. And I think because that's not its purpose, because it's not an Asian NATO, India is quite happy to push the envelope a bit with the Quad.
I've got another audience question here. Given the history, culture, language, and ethnicity of Russia and Ukraine, the viewpoint that Ukraine and Russia are really one country has sizable support in Russia independent of Putin. Do you see it being a perpetual state of hostility with Russia over this issue?
Yes, short answer. I think that if, for example, Russia invades and it becomes bogged down and Russia doesn't achieve its aims quickly, then I would say that this is going to be a long-running sore for Russia and Ukraine. There's going to be tension there, on that border for years, if not longer. And whilst we certainly do not want to give Moscow a veto over Ukrainian membership, that's unacceptable. I think everyone recognizes that Ukrainian membership in NATO is not going to happen fast. It's not going to happen anytime soon because of that reason. Because as soon as they're a member, then we're obligated under Article 5 to defend them, and that then raises the direct prospect of a military clash between NATO and Russia. Now, if Russia keeps their forces in Belarus such that they can then strike at Poland or the Baltic states much more easily, and that risk of a direct clash is there anyhow, then maybe that might mitigate against uncertainty and hesitation about bringing Ukraine in. But there is that tension between Ukraine and Russia that's going to be quite serious. And so, I wouldn't expect Ukrainian membership of NATO or the EU happening anytime quickly.
I have another audience question that's come in here, and it's touching on comments, I believe, by Maurice Payne. And the concern from the person sending in the question is, was it a good idea for Maurice Payne to kind of suggest that Australia will have no involvement if Russia does anything with Ukraine?
Well, we are involved in the sense that I believe we're assisting Ukraine with cybersecurity. And I believe that we have already discussed the possibility of sending extra natural gas supplies to Europe to assist if Russia, for example, were to cut off the flow of natural gas into Europe and thus try to penalise Europe's economic security in the depth of winter. So I think we are involved. We've made it very clear to the Russians that we do not accept Russia using military force to invade, subjugate, and annex an independent nation state. We did that in regards to Crimea, and I think we're doing it now. And MH17, how many Aussies died in MH17? So we're involved from the outset. I'm not certain that Maurice Payne is saying that necessarily we will do nothing. We're already doing things to try and support the Western position on this.
I think it's more to do with troops on the ground.
Yeah, there's no possibility of that. Ukraine is a long way from Australia, and we've got sort of our own challenges here with China. So, we would be working with the Americans and our Indo-Pacific allies to ensure deterrence holds here in the Indo-Pacific against regional threats, rather than once again getting distracted into distant conflicts.
Just to interrupt too, another audience question that came in was about where does New Zealand fit into all of this? If anything were to happen with Ukraine or Taiwan, would New Zealand do nothing?
Look, I can't honestly answer that about Ukraine, but I think Taiwan is an issue. New Zealand has its own interests and agendas, in regards to China and maintaining good relations with China. In my opinion, they need to move closer to Australia on many issues, particularly in terms of AUKUS. I was personally disappointed about New Zealand's attitude to AUKUS in terms of allowing port visits and so forth. But this is an issue for the New Zealand government. We will continue to work with them under ANZUS, which we regard as very important, under the Five Eyes, which we regard as very important. And, we treat them as a valued ally and partner in the Indo-Pacific region. And certainly we're not going to criticize them because they have a slightly different approach to China to us.
There was an article I read in The Spectator in regard to the federal government buying 120 military tanks and armoured vehicles. Why would we buy tanks if this is meant to be a sea conflict in regards to China and Taiwan? Are they to protect us or to protect Taiwan?
Look, that's a great question, and I think that it's an issue that I think needs further elaboration from the Department of Defense and from Army as to how does not only those Abrams main battle tanks, but also the new armoured fighting vehicles to be acquired under Land 400 Phase 3, how do they play a role in a future major power war in the Indo-Pacific that will be largely a maritime war? It will be at sea, it will be in the air, it will be in space and in cyberspace. So working out how we get Army into that fight, and in particular heavy forces such as tanks and AFVs, I think is an issue that no one is really explaining from the Department of Defense. ASPI has written a number of articles about this, about the value of investing in those sorts of vehicles versus other types of capabilities. The flip side to this argument, of course, is that if we do end up in a conflict where Army is involved, then having direct fire capabilities for infantry that are provided by tanks and armoured fighting vehicles is invaluable. It will save lives. So whilst I think everyone at ASPI that I've spoken to, my colleagues, have some serious questions for Army about the strategic mobility and the tactical mobility of how we get these vehicles to distant battlefields, we're not questioning their utility in terms of a tactical engagement, if that comes to it. And of course, in the unlikely scenario of a direct military incursion on Australian soil, then the tanks and the armoured fighting vehicles become invaluable. The other aspect that I would point out with the tanks and the armoured fighting vehicles is this new generation of loitering munitions that we've seen being used in the Armenian-Azerbaijan conflict in 2020, where the Azeris used kamikaze killer drones and loitering munitions to take out the Armenians' heavy armour very effectively. So if we're going to spend a lot of money on these sorts of large armoured fighting vehicles, it's no good sending them into the battle if the other side can take them out very quickly using autonomous systems. We have to be able to defend those vehicles, and Army needs to invest in that very low altitude air defence capability to protect those vehicles. Otherwise, it is a waste of money.
An audience question that's come through here touches on the submarine deal. The question pretty much is asking, do you think the feelings that France has for Australia because of that cancellation, do you think that'll have long-lasting consequences, or do you think this will only be a minor thing?
It will blow over, but it will take some time. And I think that the way the termination of the deal with Naval Group was handled badly on both sides. So, from the French side, they were at fault for not moving quickly enough and determinedly enough to address Australia's real, genuine concerns about where the project was heading in terms of the delays, the cost overruns, the lack of Australian industry content. So I think they're at fault for being rather, shall we say, relaxed and comfortable in their approach to how they were going to run this project. We were at fault, however, for the way we managed the relationship with France. We had a responsibility, I think, to engage with them more directly, more determinedly from the outset. And I think that, probably we should have handled the actual termination of contract process with a little bit more diplomatic nuance than we did. So there's enough blame to go around on both sides. I would hope that the French recognise that one arms contract, even a big one like the attack class submarines, is not of greater importance than the broader French defence and security interests in the Indo-Pacific region and the importance of the relationship with Australia. So I would hope that over time, Paris and Canberra will start talking again, and in the end, we will have a renaissance or once again a coming together where we can start talking about a better relationship. And who knows, there might be new military projects that we can work together on and learn from the mistakes made in the submarine project.
There's another audience question here. Russians believe Putin has no intention of invading Ukraine. Their threats are merely a negotiating tactic, and that the US and NATO are inflating the severity of the situation. Is this a fair take?
No, in the sense that, firstly, the negotiation process that has occurred has basically seen Russia issue unreasonable demands. Basically that they want a veto of Ukrainian membership of NATO and EU forever. That's a non-starter. And secondly, they want NATO to withdraw from Central Europe to 1997 borders, essentially abandoning all those states in Central Europe to Russian control. That's a non-starter. So the Russian negotiation process has been based on outright demands that have been completely unreasonable. NATO has gone into that diplomatic process in an effort to try and find a reasonable diplomatic approach. They've talked about a new approach to intermediate range nuclear forces, They've talked about better transparency about military exercises, allowing the Russians to monitor and visit key sites like Aegis Ashore in Romania and Poland to make it clear to the Russians there's no offensive weapons there. So I think the NATO side has really gone into it with the best of intentions to try and defuse this crisis. But the Russians, I don't think, are that serious about diplomacy, because if they were serious about diplomacy, they would not have made such outrageous demands from the outset, and they would have moderated those demands over time to come to the middle ground, and they have made no attempt to do so. So my view here is that the Russian approach to negotiation has really been about ensuring that it fails so that they then have a justification to use force. I do not believe that Moscow is serious about a diplomatic off-ramp. And as for NATO inflating the crisis, well, the Russians continue to build up their invasion forces around Ukraine and into Belarus. The types of forces they're deploying are such that we can only take from our observations that these are actual invasion forces. Their heavy armor, their air power, Iskander surface-to-surface missiles, which are nuclear capable. But now I'm not suggesting the Russians will use nukes, but the very fact that they're deploying these sorts of systems and the heavy artillery, even supplies of blood to treat wounded soldiers, everything that you would need to do a massive invasion of another country, they are putting into place. So I do not think NATO is blowing this out of proportion at all. I think that NATO has been quite objective and sensible, and it's the Russians that are spoiling for a fight.
Some of the suggestions were that sometimes the demands Russia makes to countries, they do so with not really the intention of those countries following through and actually meeting them. They were just doing that so that then they can say, oh, we tried. Was China doing that with Australia when it came to the 14 grievances?
Yes, I mean, I think that those list of 14 grievances, which are in effect demands, really displayed, China's approach to how they handle these situations. Very 19th century mindset. Here's a list of demands. You will comply with these demands if you want our goodwill. And those demands were so outrageous because they would have required Australia to give up things that are valuable to it. Its approach to Western liberal democracy, the freedom of speech, freedom of thought, a free media, the right to air our opinions on issues without being concerned about summary arrest. They wanted ASPI silenced and shut down. And they wanted, the right to essentially have Chinese citizens and potentially Australians as well, to return to China for trial. So the demand, for example, for us to recognise their interests in the South China Sea. So I do think that what you saw with those demands were two things. Firstly, the Chinese knew we'd never accept them. And that gave them the justification then to continue their campaign of coercion against us, which has been going since 2015, when we banned Huawei from bidding for the 5G national communications infrastructure. Secondly, it's designed to coerce us ultimately into accepting their interests, and we're not going to do that. So it does give us a hint of what life would be like in a Chinese-led Indo-Pacific region. If, for example, the US were to withdraw from the region in an America First type approach, if we're living in that future, then that list of 14 demands would be followed by many other lists. And the question is, how do we resist that sort of pressure if we can't count on the Americans? So I think it was a very serious step by China. They knew we weren't going to accept it, but it does kind of give us a window into a very dark future that I hope we never see.
An audience question here. Is it not more threatening to have, so this is in regards to Russia, is it not more threatening to have foreign troops on neighboring countries' soil than it is to have your own troops on your own soil? Why is Russia cast as the aggressor and NATO as the victim?
Russia is cast as the aggressor because it is. Russia is massing over 100,000 troops designed for an invasion against Ukraine. NATO is responding to that threat by ensuring its Eastern European partners are reassured of NATO's determination to defend their interests under Article 5. So, NATO is not threatening to invade another country here. Russia is. And I know that the Russian government is pushing the propaganda line that this is all NATO's fault. It's about NATO expansion and so forth. As I said at the beginning of our discussion, that's nonsense. I think that NATO's response to Russia's actions have been eminently sensible and quite appropriate, given the very clear threat that Russia is now mounting against Ukraine. And as I said, if NATO doesn't respond effectively, if it doesn't respond strongly, then what we could face is the prospect that Putin, having secured Ukraine and having massed forces then in Belarus, is well positioned then to threaten Poland or the Baltic states, both of which are NATO members, with hybrid warfare attacks. And we will not tolerate that. We didn't tolerate threats from the Soviet Union during the Cold War. That's why we kept NATO forces on high alert in close proximity to their forces along the inner German border. We're not going to accept Russian military intimidation now in 2022.
I am aware of the time as well, so I do thank you so much, Malcolm, for staying on a bit longer. My final question was, since a lot of people watching are university students, is there any advice or any opportunities you can mention to them if they want to get more involved in this kind of area in terms of work or perhaps internships or something with ASPI?
Yeah, look, I think that we're always on the lookout for talented individuals with an interest in defence and national security. I think that finishing your degrees, doing well in your studies, getting a lot of practical experience in the policy world, whether it's in government or whether it's in other areas, through non-government organisations, publishing wherever you can, I think is really important. We do have an internship program, which is a 6-month paid internship. It's very good. Unlike interns in places like Washington, D.C., who are simply there, not paid, and they make the coffee, interns at ASPI are given important writing tasks. They write articles for the strategists. They work on major projects. They help run events and so forth. So the internship program is a great way into ASPI. And from there, a lot of the interns then go into the Department of Defense or Foreign Affairs, get some more policy experience there, and some of them then come back into ASPI as researchers or senior analysts or analysts. So there is a career path, and ASPI as an organization is one of the greatest places to work because there's no top-down ASPI policy on anything. Everyone is entitled to their own opinion. We have good debates in ASPI about various different policy issues. We're not required to have a party line, if you like, on particular issues. And we encourage freedom of thought, freedom of speech. We are independent of government. So therefore, we can criticize the government. And many a time, I've written papers in the ASPI Strategist that have been critical of defense policy decisions and suggested alternatives. That's our task, is to provide alternative defence and national security policy advice to government, to shape the public debate about defence and strategic policy, and to encourage the next generation of strategic policy thinkers. And I think I would welcome anyone who's interested in ASPI to come along and have a chat over a cup of coffee. I'm happy to do that.
Perfect. So I'd like to say once again, thank you so much, Dr. Malcolm Davis. Much appreciated for coming on the show.
Thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed the discussion.
Perfect. I've been your host, Rory O'Connor. I've had my co-host with me, Andrew Kremen. This has been the Macquarie University Liberal Club Sunday session. We'll be back again next Sunday at 4:30. Thanks very much and have a good evening.